After I graduated college, I spent a summer backpacking around Europe and Israel with a friend of mine. It was a grand tour in the days when we had a paper URL pass, had to go to internet cafes to send emails home, and made the rare call using a newsstand purchased phone card in a payphone. I remember sitting in a hostel lobby in Madrid. That's hostel like a place you stay, not hostile. In a hostel lobby in Madrid, not long after the running of the bulls had taken place in Pamplona. A fellow backpacker was regaling us with stories of the running of the bulls, the narrow streets, the close calls, all the adrenaline. While no one died that year, there were 21 injuries, including a 40-year-old from Denver who was gored in the buttocks and required surgery. As this guy kept talking, my buddy and I shook our heads and gave each other a look that said, "What a moron." So oddly, I recall this story every year during the high holidays when we read the Unatana Tokef prayer, that famous prayer that delineates our possible fates in the year to come. Who shall live and who shall die? You know the one. And when we read who by war and who by beast, I always think of my braggadocio friend from Madrid. Of course, the purpose of the prayer is to stick in our head and to evoke vivid images as we recognize that our fate is never entirely in our hands, that we ultimately have little control as we experience the vicissitudes of life. But this year, with wildfires in Maui and floods in Libya, its words seem to have greater meaning. Who by fire and who by water, indeed. But here's the thing. The scenarios described in the prayer posed serious, regular, and ongoing threats to our ancestors who composed it about 1,000 years ago. But most of them do not pose much of a threat to us today. It is still true that we do not have ultimate control over the span of our lives, yet the combination of reason, science, and human cooperation has allowed us to create a world of relative well-being and safety. So, who by fire and who by water? In the US, about 4,000 people a year do die of fire, and another 4,000 people a year do die of drowning. But that means a 0.00001% chance of either happening to any one person. Who by strangling and who by stoning? There are a few pockets in Afghanistan where a few people are still stoned to death, but even Iran seems to have done away with the practice. Who by beast? About 201 people a year are killed in the US from animal attacks. No doubt tragic for them and their families, but not a serious, regular, ongoing threat to the population at large. Perhaps the number would be slightly higher if Allentown started hosting a running of the bulls. The trends are similar for most of the items in Unatana Tokef. These things do still happen, and when they do, they are unspeakably tragic, but part of the reason they are so tragic, part of the reason that we remember the stories of them happening, is that they are so rare today. Okay, so stonings are down, but is the world really getting better? You might be wondering if I have stopped reading the news. Partisanship, wildfires, global warming, threats to democracy, war in Ukraine. It's an endless list. So let me invite you to do a little bit of a thought experiment. This experiment was first proposed by former President Barack Obama, and he said, if you had to choose one moment in time to be born, any time in human history, and you didn't know ahead of time what nationality you were, or your gender, or your sexual orientation, or your economic status, you would choose today. The people of the world today have unprecedented freedom, opportunity, health, economic prospects, and education. Of course, we have serious challenges too, and I regularly speak about them from this pulpit and in the weekly emails, but the headlines belie the trend lines. News organizations still lead with the worst disasters out there. But generally speaking, where there is not a disaster, things tend to move in a positive direction. Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker suggests that most people would agree on the basic measures of human well-being: life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, and happiness. While many self-help and spiritual gurus out there would tell us to manifest these things through positive thinking, or to believe in the inevitability of human progress, Pinker takes a decidedly data-driven approach. We do not need to measure these things as articles of faith or creed. We can simply look at the data and measure them over time. For example, the average life expectancy for most of human history was 30. Today, it is closer to 70 worldwide and 80 in the developed world. 250 years ago, the wealthiest countries saw childhood mortality rates of over 30%. Today, the poorest countries have rates lower than 6%. While there are still 10 million people in danger of famine, and another 20 million people experiencing food insecurity and malnutrition around the world, in earlier centuries, famines regularly killed millions of people, which at that time represented a much larger proportion of the population. 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, 9.3% live in extreme poverty. Still too high, but we're making progress. The Russian war of aggression in Ukraine is a catastrophe. Nevertheless, for most of human history, powerful states and empires were pretty much always at war with each other. Peace was an interlude between wars. Today, great powers are never at war with each other. The last time great powers met on a battlefield was the US and China during the Korean War. While we see threats to democracy around the world, a remarkable 45% of the world's population lives in a democracy. Needless to say, that kind of self-determination was not the case for most of history. And personally, we are safer too, in just about every way when compared with a century ago. Here's what Pinker found in his research. Over the last century, we have become 96% less likely to be killed in a car crash, 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 95% less likely to be killed on the job, 89% less likely to be killed by an act of God, such as drought, flood, wildfire, storm, volcano, landslide, earthquake, or meteor strike. Presumably not because God has become less angry with us, but because of improvements in the resilience of our infrastructure. And what about that quintessential godly act, the projectile hurled by Zeus himself? We are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. So it seems that we're doing pretty well with Pinker's components of well-being: life, health, sustenance, prosperity, safety, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness, and peace. So why does everything feel so grim? Why, when I asked people what message they want to hear over the High Holy Days, did so many people say, hope? Please give us a message of hope. Things seem grim from a combination of news coverage, human psychology, and the actual problems that we have in our world. First, the old news motto, "If it bleeds, it leads," has a real impact on our views and attitudes. There has never been the following news report. Hello, I am reporting from a suburban town outside of New York. This afternoon, children had soccer practice, followed by dinners with their family and homework. They went to bed at a reasonable time. Their parents enjoyed a glass of wine. Back to you in the studio. The news reports on things that happen, not things that don't happen. All of the wonderful statistics that we just reviewed took decades to achieve. Slow, incremental change does not receive news coverage. Events that play on our worst fears, those get news coverage. Millions of people spilled, millions of words spilled describing disasters from all over the world. Breathless reports about the possible negative consequences of any possible policy decision. All of these words describing adversity have great power. Our creation myth acknowledges that by teaching that God created the world with words. Let there be light. In very real ways, words continue to create our reality. So when we read nothing but bad news, we begin to believe that all the news is bad. The scary headlines drown out the hopeful trend lines. Human psychology. Evolution hardwired our brains to protect us from risks. So, for example, we have a well-documented negativity bias. The good impacts us more powerfully than the bad. No. The bad impacts us more powerfully than the good. For example, let's say you spend a nice day with a friend who happens to make one comment that rubs you the wrong way. You could end up remembering the day just for that one comment. We also do a very poor job of calculating risk because of something called the availability heuristic. So you didn't know you were going to get a vocabulary lesson, right? The availability heuristic describes our tendency to use information that comes to mind quickly and easily when making decisions about the future. For example, we all remember the poor woman who was attacked by a shark this summer at Rockaway Beach. Perhaps you also read about the flesh-eating bacteria that tragically killed 3 people in the Long Island Sound this summer. Those dramatic, awful news stories stick in our mind, causing the average person to worry about swimming in the ocean. But we think of those 4 cases instead of the millions of people who swam in the oceans in New York without incident this summer. The availability heuristic dramatically multiplies the impact of all that negative news, causing us to worry that a highly unusual event that takes place halfway around the world will also happen to us. This is not new. Bad news and our natural psychology has caused us to view the future pessimistically for thousands of years. Jewish tradition works very hard to counter that. In the Talmud, Rabbi Meir taught that we should say 100 blessings a day. Blessings help us focus on the good in our lives. Our prayer book contains countless prayers of gratitude, many originating in the Bible itself. The words that Jews traditionally say upon waking, the same words we sing with our religious school students each Sunday morning, express gratitude for waking and for life. We find so many exhortations to express gratitude and see blessings precisely because we do the opposite. Our ancestors who actually had to worry about regular occurrences of the tragedies listed in Unetana Tokef developed these practices to help us to counter the negative bias. We need those practices because it takes work to overcome the negativity bias, the availability heuristic, and the voyeuristic obsession we have with bad news. I am not arguing for cockeyed optimism. I am not arguing for irrational positivity. I am arguing for accuracy. That means acknowledging the amazing moment that we live in, all the profound health, wealth, freedom, and knowledge, while also seeing the problems that we must address. For all its limitations, our psychology does impel us to strive for something better than we have now. We judge ourselves not by where we've come from, but where we think we should be, which reveals so much unmet potential. And the trend lines really do show that we can improve seemingly insurmountable problems. Remember, we've gone from 90% of the world living in extreme poverty to 9.3%. That is unprecedented in human history. And that did not happen through wishful thinking. It happened with hard, incremental work. It happened, as Pinker asserts, by applying the 18th century Enlightenment principles of reason and science to the enhancement of human well-being. This does not mean improvement all the time. It means that when humans apply themselves to solving problems or improving well-being, that we really can do it. Major issues are manageable when we start to see them as problems to solve rather than as apocalypses in waiting. If the odds of achieving a better world seem long, consider the odds of this very moment with all of these people occurring. Think of all of the parents who had to have children for you to exist, the thousands of generations. Think of all those who tried to rid the world of Jews. The odds of a small people from the Middle East would persist for thousands of years. Think of the evolutionary forces that led to the arrival of Homo sapiens. Think of the physics that allowed for the creation of the Earth, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe. If any one of those things had been different, we would not all be here. The fact that we are is miraculous. And still, all the forces of entropy and evolution, human folly and randomness, they're still all arrayed against us. But if we could make it this far to this moment, then we can surely surmount the problems we face today. We can use reason and science, communication and thought with human cooperation to make real incremental progress. We've done it before, and we can do it again. Now, things are better than they were 200 years ago, but things are not better than they were 5 years ago. There are more wars, less democracy, more global warming, greater childhood poverty, more guns, and a shakier global order. The fact that we cannot solve all of these problems right now hurts. The fact that we have slid backwards causes anxiety and anger. But here's the thing. There are a lot of great ideas out there already on how to solve these problems. And there are so many more solutions yet to be conceived. Reform Judaism teaches us to work on tikkun olam, repairing the world, rather than praying for some sort of instantaneous messianic redemption. We know that this takes work, the work of generations. And when we want to give up because we feel we can't solve a problem, we need to remember the words of Rabbi Tarfon. It is not your job to complete the work, and neither are you free to desist from it. Humanity has surmounted seemingly insurmountable problems since Rabbi Tarfon walked the earth in the 2nd century. When we feel anxious about the state of our world, we need to remember how far we've come. We should not rely on blind hope. We should not rely on the arc of history bending towards justice. Instead, we should remember that science and reason and humans working together can make incremental changes that can lead to real progress. That progress is not built on superstition or messianic hopes. That progress comes from slow, steady effort. That progress is built on our shared convictions that life is better than death, health is better than illness, prosperity is better than want, peace is better than war, freedom is better than subjugation, safety is better than danger, knowledge is better than ignorance, and that all of these together will lead to flourishing and happiness. This year, please, this year, let us spend less time obsessing about headlines designed to scare us. Instead, let's spend more time doing the slow, meaningful, impactful work that keeps moving the trend lines in the right direction. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will.